What's going on, guys? Hope this video finds you well. So, Fire Emblem Three Houses is an absolutely massive game, and I'm not just talking about the sheer volume of content within the game itself, but also the impact that it had, being the best-selling Fire Emblem title by a decent margin, as well as, at the time I played it, which was pretty close to release, being my personal favorite game of all time, or at the very least, certainly one of them. I put an absolutely obscene amount of time into this game within that first year or so after it came out. If I had to estimate, it's probably somewhere in the ballpark of 700 to 800 hours across something like, I want to say 8 or 9 playthroughs, but due to Three Houses being a massive game for those reasons I just mentioned, I initially was going to make this into a two-parter, because not only would that thematically make sense, but it would also allow me to tackle things at a much more measured pace. Now, that plan didn't end up coming to fruition for a number of reasons, partially because I've been very busy with other things, and also because I have decided to not continue my current replay of this game. At the time of Three Houses release, I had only played a small handful of Fire Emblem games, and since then, over the course of these past 5 years, I have, I want to say exactly or more than tripled the amount of Fire Emblem games I have finished, let alone some of the games that I have played for the first time since then but didn't finish. So suffice it to say, I'm a much more experienced Fire Emblem player than I was when this game first came out. I do still think that Fire Emblem Three Houses is worth playing for those who haven't, and for those who have played it, you'll probably already know where you stand with this game, so there's not really anything for me to say on that. But I will say that after so many playthroughs and so many hours, most of which were during that first year or so of the game's release, even during those playthroughs, there were certainly criticisms I had of every facet of this game to a certain degree. They weren't enough to deter me from wanting to play it again and again and again, clearly. And now on this most recent replay, I just feel like some of those criticisms I did previously have, and maybe even some new ones, in addition to just having played this game to death over the course of that first year, led to these criticisms being more of a sticking point for me when it comes to this game overall. And I kind of want to structure this video as giving my positive impressions, the things that I really love about any given category we'll be discussing, but then following that up with some criticisms I have. If there's anything I think is worth discussing in further depth at a later date, I will plan to do that, perhaps in an eventual discussion on Three Hopes, and kind of comparing and contrasting how these two games handle certain aspects, as well as the possibility of doing a character tier list. But with all that said, let's move on to our first category. For those of you who are able and interested in showing additional support towards me in the channel, since this is a one-man operation, I do have a Ko-fi page for direct donations, as well as the myriad ways to show support through YouTube. Thank you to those who have shown support thus far, and thank you to everyone else for your consideration. I really like the art direction and character designs, especially when it comes to the presentation of Three Houses. In particular, the way that it blends some more modern sensibilities with fantasy, like how each of the students accessorize or change the way that their uniform looks to make them stand out, as well as some of the interiors, like the way the bedrooms are laid out and stuff like that, feel more modern than what I would typically imagine as far as the way that Fire Emblem approaches fantasy. Or maybe it's just that in most Fire Emblem games, we don't really get to see a lot of the more mundane elements kind of represented. The main standout portion of the presentation in this game is the audio, not just the soundtrack, which I think, similarly to what I said about the visual design, integrates some more modern sounds into more traditional orchestral and operatic pieces, and I really love this game's soundtrack for that. Although maybe there's like 1 or 2 tracks that go a little bit too far with the electronic sounds, but for this particular game, it works really well and I really like it. I think the voice acting is also pretty great across the board. What's very impressive about this game is that pretty much, if not every single line in the game is voiced, which is kind of crazy and not something that you see very often. And I think that this game being fully voiced helps make up for some of the presentation aspects I think are lackluster. While I think the art direction is strong, playing this game on a higher resolution screen really shows how low res the textures are, how poor the draw distance can be in the Monastery as well. And those are things that I can somewhat overlook because of course it is a Switch game. This is the first Fire Emblem game developed for what I would call a console, or at least, you know, it's a console hybrid, since Radiant Dawn, which was not in high definition and was also for the Wii. So very different development landscapes as far as that. And I think for this being the first console outing for Fire Emblem in over 10 years is impressive, but even when compared to some other Switch titles, I think it is visually lacking. The character models for the most part look solid, but you can even notice some really jagged textures on some of their uniforms and whatnot. But more so than this is the canned animations that literally every character makes use of. Now, it's understandable to an extent because I think having literally every character in this game, which there are a lot of, having completely unique animations for their given reactions would be a lot to tackle and is probably unnecessary. It is something that kind of takes me out of it at certain points because I am seeing all these different characters with very different personalities in different circumstances doing the same hand gesture or doing the same shocked face and they're taken aback. It's most prevalent in the supports, which I think flesh out the characters really well. But as far as the way that the supports are presented, where it's, you know, two characters just kind of standing and talking at each other, even the environments aren't actually, I think, the environments from the monastery. They might even just be images of the environments, maybe, or maybe it's just a depth of field effect that makes it look much more static. I do think that the way they get around these limitations is kind of clever. Specifically, the way that the camera is positioned or angled will sometimes obscure that there isn't actually a book that they're holding, or that they're not actually sitting down at a table, or like whatever it might be that is kind of implied to be happening. Again, it's not really like the worst thing ever, because the most important things when it comes to the supports is the way that characters are characterized and the way that those interactions play out, which I think are generally pretty strong as far as conveying especially character development and relationship development between any particular pairing of characters. But yeah, the canned animations and those limitations were apparent to me when I first played the game, of course, but it is something coming back to it that really stands out and has me kind of wishing that it was less the case. Now moving into the story and characters. So as I mentioned, I might do a Fodlan character tier list at some point in the future. So I'm not really going to talk about the individual characters specifically. I'd like to save that. Obviously the route choice being at the very beginning bakes in some replayability inherently, in that you are given a different set of units depending on which house you pick, which I think is a good thing. It's interesting though. There are a lot of other Fire Emblem games that have route splits, but they're usually even at their earliest a few chapters in, and they're usually just for a certain stretch of the game, not the entire rest of it. It is kind of interesting and refreshing, I think, in a sense, to just pick whatever house for your first playthrough based on vibes. I also really love the lore in Fodlan. It's incredibly layered, and I do like the way that each route disperses different tidbits of lore, and you kind of, if you want the full picture, need to play all of the routes, and then you kind of are able to get a more complete picture. But even then, certain characters are unreliable narrators, or they only know so much, or they were only taught the way the world works from a particular angle, or maybe there are some lies mixed in to varying degrees from different parties. It's really cool in that way, and I think is kind of a clever use of the alternate path, alternate timeline kind of thing that is happening with each route choice, because obviously the story ultimately plays out differently depending on which route you take. You would kind of assume that that would be the case. And I already mentioned that the characters I think are really strong. The core players, as far as characters are concerned, kind of carry the plot as a whole. And I say that because there are some elements to the plot specifically that I think are a more major factor as far as my loss of interest halfway through my most recent playthrough. The big thing is that part 1 plays out pretty much exactly the same regardless of which route you take, which is a bummer. You're obviously interacting with different characters if you're focusing on the characters that are actually in your house, of course, and some of them have unique things to say when you are their professor versus when you're not. I do appreciate that, and there is definitely somewhat of a different vibe depending on which house you pick, particularly because you're going to different house leaders on the same events that are happening regardless of route. I will say also that the focus of the main missions in part 1 are weirdly focused on the Blue Lions specifically. I love the Blue Lions as much as the next person, but it would have been nice for, if you picked Golden Deer, maybe there's more missions that have to do with the Alliance, or if you pick Black Eagles, there's more to do with the Empire in part 1. So I feel like something is lost when you don't have Sylvain when you go to face Miquelon, or when you don't have Ash when you take down Lord Lanato, and I'm sure there's a couple of other examples mixed in there as well. I get that this game was ambitious enough as it stands, and the fact that there are 4 routes to play through is admirable in some sense, and a lot to take on from a development point of view. It has me wondering almost if Blue Lions were going to be the only playable faction at one point, or at the very least they were probably the first ones to be made, I would guess. I think my biggest problem with this is that it feels like the Golden Deer and Black Eagles are doing fuck all while you're doing like the actual important missions, assuming you pick Blue Lions, which I did for this playthrough, so I'm just speaking from that perspective. And then if you are playing as those factions, you're kind of taking part in events that aren't really related to those characters, and it's just kind of a weird disconnect. Of course, once you get to part 2, things differentiate quite a bit, although it's been noted that Verdant Wind, aka the Golden Deer route, as well as Silver Snow, which is the Black Eagles route if you don't side with Edelgard, are very similar. It's also been noted by a lot of people that Crimson Flower, which is the Black Eagles route when you do side with Edelgard, is shorter and feels not as fleshed out. Like there are certain scenes that in other routes would be important enough to get cutscenes cutscenes, but you just kind of get these still images. It kind of feels more like an afterthought. It would be weird, I think, if Silver Snow was the only Black Eagles route, because then you just don't even get to use Edelgard and Hubert. And the tricky thing about doing a Silver Snow run also is that you have to deploy Edelgard, but you don't really want her to get experience because that would be better served on the units that are actually going to continue with you. I'm sure there are some players out there who didn't get the option to pick Crimson Flower and had invested into Edelgard and Hubert heavily, and then you lose access to them for Silver Snow, which is kind of the default Black Eagles route. I think it would have made more sense if Crimson Flower was the more fleshed out Black Eagles route compared to Silver Snow. Although again, Silver Snow is so similar to Verdant Wind that it makes Azure Moon or the Blue Lions route feel more unique, and therefore kind of hints towards that being maybe the initial route that was developed. The other thing is each of the routes, even with the differences in part 2, there's still like a lot of maps that are used just with different contexts and at different points in the story. Like in Verdant Wind, I think you go to the capital first and take down Edelgard, and then you go to Shambhala and take down those who slither and, you know, ultimately fight Nemesis and stuff like that. Whereas in Azure Moon, Edelgard is the final boss of that route. I think you actually kill Arundel or Talus impersonating Arundel as opposed to going and taking down Talus separately. And the fact that in Crimson Flower, you don't even take down those who slither at all. Clearly they ran out of time or something like that and had to polish things up without adding what likely would have been a sequence at the end of Crimson Flower. That would only make sense for that to be the last thing, because they mention it in the epilogue and just kind of say Edelgard and her army took down those who slither in the dark. They lived happily ever after the end or whatever. And so I feel like clearly that would, in an ideal situation, be what the last few chapters of Crimson Flower would be. So yeah, there's definitely some missed potential when it comes to differentiating the routes. And I think something that also kind of burnt me out on this recent playthrough is the fact that I've seen White Clouds play out in literally every one of my playthroughs, whereas I've only seen Azure Moon, Verdant Wind, and Crimson Flower and Silver Snow like twice each, if that, because Silver Snow I think I might have only done once. So I feel like once you get to part 2, because it is at least somewhat more distinct from route to route, that to me is like the more exciting part of the game. And I get that on a first run, White Clouds is, you know, building the world up, setting up the characters for their arcs later on, setting up certain plot elements and stuff like that. And I can appreciate a slow burn when it comes to a narrative in, you know, a more traditional RPG or something like that. I don't mind replaying in that case if I love said story for other reasons or for the payoff later on or whatever. My thing with Three Houses in particular is I don't think that the plot specifically is the strongest aspect or the main reason why I loved this game as much as I did when it first came out. Of course I was intrigued to see what happens and stuff like that, and of course, you know, Geralt's death does hit to a certain extent, but I just think that the events of part 2 are much more interesting, especially because the antagonists, particularly in part 1, just aren't really that great in my opinion. Like those who slither are very mustache twirling evil. I just think they're kind of underwhelming. I think part of that is also what I said about the canned animations. Seeing Talus and Kranya and Solon and all of them doing like the same or similar animations to like the other characters when they're trying to be threatening and imposing, I just don't think it works very well. Even the Flame Emperor, whose portrait I think looks, you know, mysterious and intimidating or like whatever you want to call it, but then them standing there in that very like stock standing position, and it's not that they aren't threatening in a literal sense as far as like what they've accomplished, but even then I just think they're kind of lame in this game. And yeah, as far as the plot itself in part 1, it really is mostly world building and kind of showing that there is unrest, just kind of generally speaking, across Fodlan, despite the seeming era of peace that they're in, and you're kind of facing the consequences of a lot of the events that happened in the lore. I could talk more on this. I'm sure there will be plenty more to say as far as Three Hopes, because as far as what little I've played of that so far, things are very different. So if there's anything else that I want to dive into deeper, if there's anything you want to hear me talk about more deeply in that Three Hopes video, let me know in the comments and I will try to make note of it when I get around to that game. But for now, let's move into the next section, which is the structure of Three Houses. So of course I mentioned the route split. Of course I mentioned there's a part 1 and part 2 with a time skip in there, which just, you know, kind of a side note, I really do like time skips in media, particularly and specifically if the characters get redesigns and all of that. I think that's really cool. There's a calendar system. It's very Persona-esque in that way, although you play it out week by week instead of day by day. While this game does give you a lot of freedom as far as like how you can spend your time, I do find that this is the aspect of Three Houses that dragged my most recent experience. In my experience playing this game for however many hours and playthroughs that I mentioned at the beginning, it's good to explore the monastery at least once per month. In my experience, seminars are kind of like not really worth doing, at the very least if you're trying to build your characters in a specific way. And then resting just seems like a total waste of time to me, because you could explore the monastery, get more done, and max everyone's motivation at least once you level up your professor level enough to do that. But even then you can give them gifts and stuff, so like resting just doesn't seem worth it. I think the sort of the creator recharges when it gets awoken, and I think it also recharges when part 2 starts as well, and you can also repair it, albeit with some pretty rare materials, I think, but the game gives you enough to where I just don't think that resting is like ever worth doing. And even on maddening with the auxiliary battles, the fact that you can only do 1 at first and the max ends up being 3 when your professor level's high enough, I just think it's too much. It feels like filler content for the sake of being high enough level to have a chance against these extremely inflated enemy stats, particularly in part 2. So I think it's warranted to do them, but I do feel that sentiment of like wanting to just get to the main missions, because the main missions I still find to be very enjoyable, even if they are the same from route to route in part 1. And so I just think that structurally this game really drags on repeat playthroughs. I don't think it's so bad that you couldn't stomach doing each route once, maybe with some breaks in between or something, and I kind of wish that I had just done each route once initially and then just stepped away from the game instead of, you know, replaying and replaying and replaying. This game also does a good job of placing limitations on the player while keeping the systems flexible. You know, if a character has a negative affinity with a certain weapon type or something, it's probably best that you don't do a build that involves that. Not every character has a great spell list, which is definitely something to consider. It seems like the class selection is pretty vast at first, but then you realize certain classes are just better versions of others. I'm all for going for unconventional builds. That's kind of what I was doing this time around, even though usually it's probably best to just min-max. Like if a character has a high strength growth by default, it's probably best to just double down on that instead of trying to make them a magic user. But that does in some sense feel like it pigeonholes certain characters into certain roles, at least if you're not willing to go against the grain, because technically you can have any character do anything. Now, how effective they might be is really going to depend. People have figured out that the Wyvern Lord, as far as physical classes go, is the best. Mounted / flying units in this game not only have Canto in that they can move the remaining amount of move after taking certain actions, they can do it after literally any action, including participating in combat. Flying units aren't hindered by any terrain, and the fact that you can dismount eliminates the weakness to archers and wind magic and all of that. I just find that to be an incredibly boring sentiment, though, that you would just make every physical attacker a Wyvern Lord because that is in a lot of ways the best physical class in the game. I usually try to keep a variety where maybe I have 2 flyers max, maybe like 2 mounted, and then a few foot units or like whatever, just for variety's sake. A small note is I wish that each character could keep their unique designs in any class as opposed to specific ones. That's kind of a bummer because I don't really like the class designs that much. I kind of prefer, especially in the war phase, the way the character models look when they're in the monastery. I enjoy a more traditional Fire Emblem experience where characters do what they're going to do, and they have maybe not necessarily a set class, but they are limited in some way as far as what classes they can become, or at the very least you have to invest a lot more to get them to turn into a class that is very different from what they start as. I think there's something to be said for that. I think that it allows for a more delicately crafted difficulty curve, whereas here I feel like the difficulty, especially on maddening, relies very heavily on Divine Pulse, especially in part 2. I didn't find part 1 to be nearly as Divine Pulse heavy this time around. I think partially because not only have I played this game to death, but because I played so many more Fire Emblem games since my last Three Houses playthrough. I think I've just gotten better at playing Fire Emblem, so I didn't have to Divine Pulse nearly as much. But then you get to part 2, I feel like there's a massive difficulty spike there. It's probably mostly that reunion at dawn is insane, because you just start with Byleth and Dimitri in this case, or Claude if you're playing Golden Deer. That's like a major disadvantage, obviously, but even then, the stat inflation is like kind of crazy. And I appreciate the challenge because I thought hard mode at the launch of the game was too easy, even having not played that many Fire Emblems prior. From what I recall in part 2 especially, the ambush reinforcements once you pass a certain tile or after a certain turn or whatever, some of them are foreshadowed or telegraphed to an extent, but a lot of the time, because the stats are so inflated on enemy units, which I think I prefer to facing large amounts of weaker units, I definitely prefer facing a smaller, stronger army. Although I feel like in Three Houses case, it's like large, strong armies. It's a lot to maneuver, especially if you're not going to use Divine Pulse. I feel like that's probably nearly impossible, actually. There's so many factors, especially when you account like gambits, which, you know, are your method of AoE basically, which I think is a cool addition. I was kind of iffy on it at first because it was just different from, I think, any other Fire Emblem title, but I've really come to appreciate that aspect. And then of course, you know, combat arts not being tied to the weapons like they are in Shadows of Valentia, and instead being tied to the characters themselves. Certain characters learning certain combat arts, others not. That's another thing that kind of has you wanting to use certain characters with certain weapons. If someone gets Swift Strikes or any of the other powerful like late game combat arts for any given weapon type, you kind of want them to be using that weapon type so that way they can use that, because they might not even get any good combat arts really with the other weapons. That's definitely something that, if you're knowledgeable at least, would prevent you from just giving characters weapons willy-nilly. It's really best to, I think, focus on like 1 or 2. And in particular, if you look at the combat arts these characters can learn, it's best to obviously focus on the weapon types that they get good combat arts in, or unique combat arts at least. When it comes to the ambush reinforcements though, back to that, it's like, what else are you supposed to do? Because the enemy units are so powerful, and because you're investing so much much as far as time and resources and stuff into your 10 to 12 person squad or whatever it is. The deployment limit is usually somewhere in that range. If you lose someone, especially late on, that's like a massive hit that you probably don't want to take. You probably do want to just Divine Pulse back. And I know that a lot of players, including myself being guilty of this, would in older Fire Emblem titles prior to rewind mechanics reset when you lose a key unit or something like that. I think there's something to be said playing without doing that, especially the better you get and the more knowledgeable you get, I should say, at playing Fire Emblem titles. The better you're going to play and therefore try to mitigate the RNG as much as possible and therefore probably not lose too many especially powerful units surprisingly. That's why Iron Man challenges and stuff like that exist in Fire Emblem. Maybe playing through hard again for the first time in a while would have resulted in a smoother experience, but then I feel like it kind of takes a lot of the value of building your units in certain ways. I feel like that's best leveraged on maddening, but then at the same time, the way maddening's balanced is just so in favor of Divine Pulse, ambush reinforcements, or sudden gambit, or oh, you missed a gambit that was crucial to not losing someone, if not multiple people. It almost becomes even more RNG dependent than the older titles, which you would kind of think it'd be the opposite. Even though the maps are reused playthrough to playthrough, I do actually enjoy the main missions, largely. Part 2 does rely on defeat boss as its win condition, maybe a little bit too much, and the fact that you can abuse the various stride gambits that there are, as well as warp, that does take quite a bit of knowledge and setup in a lot of cases. Some cases not so much. Of course you have like the enemy intent lines, or whatever you want to call them, that show where enemies are likely to target. I feel like if you didn't have those in this particular game, I don't even know how you would necessarily get through it because of the crazy shit that it throws at you. The other thing though, which I think is a good thing to an extent, is that enemies will change their plan of attack. If an enemy unit weakens someone in range to be killed by another, but that other unit was targeting someone else, they'll change their target to secure the kill. And in some cases too, if you're like out of range or they're at a disadvantage, they'll use a gambit as well. It just is like a lot to factor in. I do think that the way skills are handled here is better than Awakening and Fates. You have one personal skill on each character, and then you have a couple of class skills or abilities or whatever they're called that you actually set for your characters. That's another element of customization that I like. Another problem is that Vantage and Death Blow and some of these other abilities are like so superior to other class mastery abilities that you want most of your physical fighters to be a brigand, at least for long enough to master it and get Death Blow, so you can have that for the rest of the run. I just think that the gameplay balance could have used another layer or two, or maybe even 3 of polish, whatever that might mean. Part of me thinks that some of these refinements and like some kind of definitive edition patch or something like that would shore up some of this game's problems. At the same time, I'm like, well, how much would it really? At least having the option to do like multiple meals in a row and just like doing those all at once kind of deal, or use multiple pieces of bait for the fishing to get your professor level going faster. It just drags structurally, and the gameplay things is really just a bunch of balance problems, with mostly things being overtuned both on the player side and the enemy side in different ways. I still do feel very engrossed and engaged in the main missions, despite how ridiculous they can be difficulty-wise in part 2 in particular. It is something that I do very much enjoy the process of while I'm doing it. It's just when I take a step back and I think about it, I'm like, well, why do I feel the need to do so many auxiliary battles to have a chance, right? I'd rather the game be scaled back a bit in difficulty and not have to do maybe any auxiliary battles or something like that, or only do auxiliary battles if I feel underleveled. And even then, because the calendar system, if you haven't done auxiliary battles and you haven't made backup saves, then you're kind of screwed. You could actually pretty easily soft lock yourself if it weren't for the fact that you can lower the difficulty, I think. I don't want it to sound like I hate this game now or something like that, because I don't. The aspects that I love, I really love, and I feel like Three Hopes at the current moment is really scratching a similar itch as Three Houses did, and I'm hoping that maybe that game will be something that I can come back to with more regularity to experience this world and these characters again, albeit in a different fashion. As far as where I stand with this game, outside of the flexibility of how you can build your units, which there are basically infinite possibilities, I feel as though I've seen and done pretty much everything else this game has to offer. And I think this is accentuated by the various aspects and criticisms that I delved into in this video. I think the most important thing from Intelligent Systems' perspective is that the right lessons were learned from this game's reception as far as what resonated with people and what caused it to be such a hit, which in my opinion are surprisingly deep and interesting characters, a compelling, if messy at times, main story with lots of great world building and lore and all of that, and at least some level of unit customization. And that's to say that I will be getting around to playing Fire Emblem Engage sooner than later. I of course want to thank my channel members and shout out Space Cowboy EXE at the Super Shadow Operative tier. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe of course if you enjoyed, and I will catch you guys in the next video.